Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast. I'm Timur Durrani, national reporter and Manitoba correspondent for the Globe and Mail, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and the Dene people. Winnipeg is the birthplace of the Métis Nation and the heart of their homeland. I am grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. Today, our conversation is focused on data resiliency for businesses, a topic I've covered extensively during my time at the Globe. Our speakers will be examining what business leaders can do to ensure that they have the infrastructure in place that will allow them to prevent, withstand, and rebound from a cyber attack. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would like to recognize IBM for today's event. We'll be taking audience questions during the last 10 minutes of today's webcast, so if you have any questions for our speakers, please submit them to our virtual Q&A box. You should see it right there. Now let's get started. I'd like to welcome Ruth E. Promislow, partner at Bennett Jones. We also have here Sam Werner, who is Vice President of Storage Product Management at IBM. And then we have Robert Gordon, Strategic Advisor for the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, and Steve McGowan, Vice President of Cybersecurity for Cineplex. Thank you all for joining me. I'll start by a question that I'm going to ask each of you. Can each of you tell us a little bit about yourself as it relates to today's topic? It's a complicated one, and you all do different tasks and different things with your roles. How about I start with you, Ruth? You tell us a little bit about where you are coming from with this topic of cybersecurity and data resiliency.
Sure, thank you. I'm a partner at Bennett Jones, and I lead the cybersecurity practice here at the firm. And that practice involves three main areas. I work with clients and guide them on cyber preparedness. And we do that with a view not just to minimizing the risk of attack, but also maximizing their ability to respond effectively to an attack and mitigate any regulatory or litigation exposure. The second element that I deal with is guiding clients through a breach, through a cybersecurity event, and helping them develop a strategic plan. And then the third part is if any litigation unfolds as a result of a cyber attack, I assist clients with that as well.
And I'll go around the room, so we'll go to you, Bob, next.
Yeah, thank you, Timur. I mean, essentially, the topic for today is at the core of what the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange does. So we're set up by the private sector to do two things. We share cyber threat information amongst member companies, and then we create a lot of environments where members can get together and share best practices and ideas. So basically, how do we try to build up that cyber resilience that they all need so much to deal with all the cyber attacks that are coming through? So everything we're doing today is core to the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. So looking forward to the conversation.
And Steve, we'll go to you next.
I've worked for a lot of different companies, and I would say the importance of cyber resilience for your data is different in every one of those companies. It really depends on what data does your company depend upon to make money, and where does the revenue come from. I worked 5 years in the big data department for the Royal Bank of Canada. It's fairly obvious, so I have a big data background. It's fairly obvious that data is critical to Royal Bank of Canada's core business. Other businesses, it could be small mom and pop shops, smaller businesses. It really depends on without the data that you depend on to make business. How could you function? How could you get it back up and running? This is the most important things. I was brought into a company that was mid-breach, and they didn't have a plan in advance. And it's really an ugly mess when it's not pre-thought out, pre-planned out. How are you going to recover? That's the big thing. And so lessons learned, a lot of experience, but it's not really the same for every company. It's your crown jewels and your crown jewel data really is a package that varies quite a bit from company to company.
And we'll certainly get into that because there's so many different of those problems that we're seeing now with different companies depending on the company, right? Sam, how about you? You tell us a little bit about where you're coming from for this chat and the experience that you're bringing to this.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here. And Steve helped set it up a bit of why I'm here. Some of you may have noticed in the intro, my title is storage. It's not cybersecurity or anything like that. But at the end of the day, when a cyber attack happens, they're going after your data, and whether it's exfiltration of your data or encrypting your data so you don't have access to it. And all of that data is sitting out on storage. And I've spent the last 20 years of my career working with enterprises in storage and helping them figure out their strategy around disaster recovery, how they're going to back up applications to protect them from other types of incidents. And this is kind of the next evolution of all that. And obviously, as the product management executive for the IBM storage portfolio, we're looking across all of our enterprise storage capabilities and how we help our customers protect their data and recover in the event something happens to their data.
I want to lay the land here before we get into the nitty-gritties of this, because it is a complicated topic, as all of you have mentioned. So, Bob, I'll start with you. What does the threat landscape currently look like for Canadian companies? Because people coming into this might not know where we exactly are at this point.
Really good question. I mean, according to a recent survey that was done, Canadian businesses rank cyber incidents as the second highest risk that they're facing. And unfortunately, those risks are becoming realized. I mean, the most recent survey from Stats Canada found that almost 20% of Canadian businesses were impacted by cyber incidents. And most of us believe that reporting is actually under-reporting, and it's actually much higher than that. And what that means, like in real life, if you're walking down the Yonge Street here in Toronto, every fifth building you go by, every fifth business were hit by a cyber attack. And so the question is why? And I mean, and Steve started to talk about that a little bit when he started to talk about data. Because businesses are now essentially data businesses. Every business operates on it. It's an essential element for it. And it runs from the biggest to the smallest business. Doesn't matter the sector or what you do, because data is what keeps you running. And it ranges from things like intellectual property, trade secrets, and you usually think about that as in the bigger companies, but it could be what they call the magic sauce. What is it that gives you that competitive edge in keeping you going? But it's also things like customer information, inventory, billing information, and your employees' personal information. And all that data that is so valuable to you, that keeps you running, that's what makes you a target for criminals. And I guess sort of when you're starting to look at who's after you, if you're in the critical infrastructure sector, and we see this reporting in the press all the time, countries like Russia, China, Korea going after you. But the biggest risk that Canadian companies are facing is from cyber criminals. They're motivated by trying to get money. They're organized. They run it like a business. Comes with from franchises and help desk and reward programs for their folks. Some of them are really technically sophisticated, but unfortunately they don't need to be, because a lot of the tools and techniques that they need, they can actually download it from the internet. And then we're also seeing some countries actually permit their criminals to operate going through. And so getting back to the data part, back to what Steve was talking about, the use of ransomware has become the weapon of choice. And that's because what they want to do is go after that data that you need to keep your business operating. And they do a couple things. They may encrypt it, in which case you can't get access to your data until you agree to pay the ransom. But what we're seeing most recently, they may encrypt it, but more likely what they're going to do is they're going to steal it. And they're going to put it up for sale on the internet or sell it off to someone else to try to make you pay the ransom. And unfortunately, this has become a very lucrative business. About 68% of all the cyber attacks in Canada revolve around ransomware. And we tend to pay. We pay the ransom. About 67% of all the attacks the victims are paying. And the median price for a ransomware attack today, just over $500,000. And that adds up to a total breach impact last year. We're around $5.5 million in the total breach cost running through it. And unfortunately for us, and I don't want to say good for the criminals, but their chances of getting caught, pretty limited. I think we'll cover some of the other things as we go through the conversation.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing, right? Because we're seeing these companies still keep going through it. And yet it's been something that, has been pointed out time and time again, right? Like the statistics that we're talking about that you mentioned yourself from StatsCan and from many other agencies that have come out, these statistics are now also old almost, it seems like, right? Because we've been seeing them over and over again, year after year, increasing, and the landscape seems to only be getting worse. I guess my other question now, and I'll go to you, Steve, for this first, and then I'll go around the room, is what is preventing companies from being able to recover from these incidents? And an incident specifically like this, that is a cyber attack or a ransomware attack specifically, perhaps, what is happening here from the company level that is preventing them, Steve?
Well, I mean, many layers to that. A lot of smaller companies just can't afford the resources, the highly trained resources. It's very expensive to protect yourself. And, you know, for small mom and pop shops, they just can't afford it. And they don't have the skill sets. They don't have the understanding. But I'd say number one, over and above everything else, is a plan. Incident response plan. Like, have it thought out in advance. Think about it. Even if you are a small mom and pop and you don't have access to sophisticated resources, think about what you would do, like how you would react to it. The big thing is, you know, it's not enough just to have backups anymore. They have to be immutable backups, because ransomware is famous for corrupting your backups. So just understanding what's the difference between a backup and an immutable backup. And paying the ransom is a terrible strategy. They say, I think on average, 80% of people who pay the ransom end up getting hit 2 and 3 more times. They come back for more once they realize you're going to pay. So it's not a good strategy. And quite often you'll pay them and they might not give your data back. They might not. That has happened, right? You know, you're not dealing with, you know, an honorable group here. So it's important to understand that your number one strategy is to plan to just recover and restore everything. The most important part of that strategy is to figure out what data is directly linked to your ability to make money as a company. Because not all data is created equal. Some things, we call them crown jewel, not just applications, but crown jewel data. And that's different for every business. But figure out what data your revenue comes from, what data, because I've seen many stats, 60, 70, 80% of companies that suffer a complete data loss are out of business within 2 years. That's true. You know, like if you can't get your data back, if you have to start from scratch, most small businesses are devastated. So understand what data is mapped directly to your revenue stream, and protect that data properly. If you don't have the sophisticated resources, get yourself a third-party provider that does understand it and knows how to do it. But overall, over and above everything else, figure out what data matters, protect it, and then know how you're going to bring it back. It's one thing to just have it on a shelf, but you have to have a plan that says, okay, in order to bring these systems back, you have to at least have a reasonable plan. Most companies fail to do that. And then when it hits, it's panic mode. Everybody's running around and, you know, freaking out, wondering what they're going to do. And it's really, really, it doesn't go well. I've seen it, trust me. Having a plan in advance is everything.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, you know, I think when we've spoken to the police agencies and stuff too about this, you know, and it's something that Bob mentioned, there is a very limited chance to even catch after it's done, right? And so no matter what happens, when you do pay the ransom, you find yourself in a space that at that point, whatever could be helped of you is also not be able to be helped in some ways either, right? But it is in some ways the only choice you feel, because it's just it's the emotional problem of an attack that you go through, right? That you deal with, especially as a small business that doesn't have those resources. Ruth, where are you at from this perspective? What do you think is preventing companies, you know, from dealing with these attacks in the right way?
I want to pick up on a point that Steve made, which is he touched on the data map, and I just want to expand on that, because it's such a critical component to effective preparation. If you take 2 different companies who are hit with the exact same ransomware attack, one company knows exactly what information they have. They know what category it is, whether it's personal information, third-party confidential information, their own proprietary information. They know where in their network it resides precisely. They know who has access to it. They know how it's transmitted. They know the purposes for which they have it and how long they need to retain it for. If they have all that mapped out, they can very effectively recover from a ransomware attack, particularly if they have reliable backups, because they can get ahead of what we call this public shaming issue, where the threat actors post your information. If you know what you have and what your contractual or regulatory obligations are with respect to that information, you can get ahead of the threat actors. You can notify the individuals, you can notify the regulators, notify your third-party commercial partners. You're not worried about public shaming. If you don't know what you have, where it resides, why you have it, who touches it, how long you're supposed to have it for, you have a whole different problem on your hands. Not only do you have issues with respect to the breach, but you possibly have a whole bunch of other regulatory privacy issues, possibly offside of your contractual obligations. So preparation is number one.
Sam, what do you think about this? The prevention of these attacks?
Yeah, I mean, both Ruth and Steve made some really great points. I don't have a ton to add to that, except I'll just say this. The average company we work with takes about 21 days to recover from an attack. And the reason is they didn't have a complete strategy. Back to what Ruth said and Steve said about categorizing and understanding your data, knowing the importance of the data and what would be considered part of your minimum viable company, which data needs to be brought back in order to resume operations as a company. Because that's the most important thing, right? Getting back to doing whatever you do, depending on your industry, and serving your clients. You have to have immutable copies of your data, copies that can't change, and you're going to likely put those somewhere that is a slower recovery type of medium. So how long does it take to bring that data back to resume your application? If you try to bring everything back at once, that's going to be problematic as well. So you need to have a clear strategy on that.
I think one of the things that, you guys have all touched on is in fact data resiliency and the preparation in order to be prepared for these attacks, right? And that's really what's preventing companies a lot of the time to be able to withstand that effects of of a cyber attack and incidents like this. But one of the things I guess I'm also wondering, and Sam, I'll go to you first about this specifically because you work with data storage, is how do you know you are prepared when you're assessing your data resiliency as a company? Like, what are some of the first things you should be looking at to find that you are prepared, in fact, with the data that you have, that it is resilient and it is something that you're holding as a crown jewel, as Steve has mentioned?
Yeah, so I think most companies have some strategy around if there's a disaster, maybe my office catches on fire or I lose access to my data. Here's what my backup is, the frequency that I make that backup and how I restore it. Or if I have an application developer who fat fingers an update to a database and corrupts a table and they need to restore it, they know exactly I made a copy of that 3 hours ago. Here's where the backup is, and I bring it back and recover it. They have that, and they've been doing that for years. And the sophistication of this has grown over time, having multiple different locations, leveraging the cloud as a repository to keep you extra safe. People have these strategies and they've planned them. Now, in the world that I've been in for many years around disaster recovery and in logical data corruption, whatever you want to call these different types of scenarios, people do it and they don't test it a lot of the times. They've gotten better at testing it so they can ensure that if I need to restore this database, it'll actually come back. First of all, enterprises or companies or small businesses, whoever you are, you do need to practice this stuff and try it. Number one. So hopefully you have a strategy for your key data, or for most of your data, you're testing it. The next thing is you need to go back to what Ruth said and understand, and I guess Steve said it too, what are the most mission critical applications, identify those, and those should be at the top of the list for testing. And then the last piece, now cyber attacks are different than like the office caught on fire, because I know exactly the last time I did a copy, and I know I can recover that copy. It's sitting in a cloud, and I restore it, and I'm up and running. The problem with a cyber attack is if it was already in your previous copy, that copy doesn't work. So how many copies do you need? So you start having to ask yourself a question of how am I going to accelerate detection? How frequently am I running software that scans data and validates that the data is good and I'll be able to recover it? So it's more than testing every once in a while. You have to have a strategy for how you check your backups or your whatever replicated copy, depending on the extent to which you do data resiliency and disaster recovery. You need to have a strategy of frequency, how long you're going to keep it, and how you're going to test and examine that data to ensure that if an event happens, you can recover it. So I know there's a lot there, and I think Steve made a very good point, which is if you don't have the skills there are plenty of companies out there. I mean, obviously, I work for one of them that can assist you in doing an assessment. We do cyber resiliency assessments. We come in and look at your current strategy and help you identify gaps in what you're doing. And then we can help you implement an approach to recovery if an event does happen.
Steve, I'll go to you next, because the thing that you mentioned about crown jewel applications for organizations and why they're so important is such an interesting point. To protect them as critical assets. I guess I'm wondering, what do you think from a strategy perspective, how should you be arranging around that in terms of making sure that those crown jewels are protected then?
From a business perspective, obviously it's, what percentage of your revenue is derived from what data, and it's, everything is in tiers, right? There's first, second, third level, and it's also important to understand that quite often data is not just, it just doesn't exist by itself. It's not just a repository that you access. It's usually accessed through an application. And quite often that application can have dependent applications. So there are secondary and tertiary mappings to other applications. So with respect to what Sam talked about with testing the restoration, you don't want to find out when the gun's to your head that you forgot about a third level application, that without that communication, the whole function of the main application and the data doesn't work. So you really, there's some effort required here. And if you're a small shop without, a fulsome IT team or whatnot, that's where you really need to depend on a third-party partner who has the expertise and can flesh these things out and explain them to you and build a plan. We call them crown jewels. Crown jewels are the applications that your revenue stream depends upon. And, that can go pretty deep into an organization, far deeper than most companies realize. You think, just the data repository itself is all you need until you find out that there are all these secondary and tertiary connections. Again, you need help if you don't have the sophistication and the skill set yourself. Small startup companies and whatnot, they don't have big IT teams. It's tough to do all this stuff on your own. You need the expertise to get it right, because if you don't get it right and test it in advance, as I said, I've seen it firsthand. It does not work out well, and quite often it's the end of there are now ransomware has gotten far more sophisticated than it used to be, and as Bob pointed out, you don't have to be a 30-year developer with all this experience to do it. There's ransomware as a service. You can buy it for $500 on the dark web. Like a 14-year-old in their basement could figure out how to do this stuff now. That's the scary part of it. So, it's really become prolific, and people, mostly in other countries, I have to say, have figured out that, for political purposes or for financial gain, this is very profitable. So, take that seriously. The whole plan needs to be mapped out and it needs to be tested. But, it's all dependent on what percentage of your revenue comes from what data and the applications that support it.
Yeah, Ruth, one of the things that Steve mentioned really made me think about some of the things that you mentioned earlier before this chat about, ransomware attacks and the proliferation of that based on this ransomware as a service model that we're talking about, right? And the idea that companies are navigating this in different ways is so interesting to me. How are you finding that with the companies that you're working with, the significance of this as cyber attacks, the state of ransomware being so hard to navigate?
Well, there's certainly an increasing appreciation by commercial entities that investing in preparation is key. And years ago, when I talked to boards or organizations about this, they sort of wave it off like, oh, how likely is that? And we'll wait and deal with it when it happens. But when you start putting numbers up front and you take the numbers of, okay, if we're down for 2 weeks, what is our business interruption loss? Like, well, let's quantify that now, because take that number and then the investment of preparation actually doesn't look so bad. In fact, it looks pretty good. And you actually have to know what that number is to really be prepared, because when you're in a position of having to make some quick decisions about, do we really need to pay this ransomware? And of course, there are many reasons why it's not ideal to pay, but some businesses, the fact is they need to pay to continue. But without an appreciation of what the cost is, it's just sort of a guessing game, and you need to have hard numbers. They're estimates, but you need to have an appreciation of what the cost is going to be. So I think the companies that are navigating well are investing up front. They have an appreciation for what the cost is of an attack, not just the ransomware payment and everything, paying lawyers and forensic experts, but the downtime. And they're also, we've talked about when we talk about preparation and planning and testing, we should talk about the tabletop scenario. That is such an important piece of bringing together the incident response team and putting before that team in real time worst case scenarios and seeing how that team reacts to it. One of the best things I see when I work with clients on tabletop scenarios is we're going through a fake scenario, but then they say, well, why did we have this data? Or why were we storing it here anyway? That's so weird. Or why did everyone have access to this information? That makes no sense. So you come to these realizations about like what I'd call low-hanging fruit about security that you can quickly address. Like, okay, let's cut off access to everyone who doesn't need it. And let's get rid of all the data we no longer need or we shouldn't even have. There are things that you can quickly address that the tabletop scenarios really bring to the surface, and they're so critical, and they go hand in hand with testing the backups and knowing that they're reliable and quantifying your business interruption costs.
Ruth, I'll stay with you for a second before I go to Bob next. But you mentioned something about the data that you do hold and how tabletop exercises in particular allow you to sort of realize where those low-hanging fruits are that you can sort of figure really out. One of the other things that I've thought about a lot is the significance of third-party data a company might be housing when they're attacked. And so tell me a little bit about that. Where is this fitting into the ransomware problem of it all?
So there's two main categories of third-party information. There's personal information. So if you have consumer data, you will likely have regulatory obligations with respect to that information that you need to pay attention to. Not just Canadian regulatory obligations. You may have obligations under the regulations of other countries, depending on what information you have. And then you may also have third-party confidential information. And this is an area where I find organizations typically they're very mindful of personal information, so either the consumer information or their employee information, but they forget about all the third-party commercial information that they have. And when they have an attack and all their information is encrypted and exfiltrated, and I ask this question, they say, oh, we're sure we have third-party confidential information. We don't know what we have. We don't know what contracts govern that. We don't know what notification obligations we have. We're not even sure how we're offside or what would make us offside this contract. So when I work with clients up front, that's one of the things we chart out. Let's, in a state of calm, when we're not under attack, when we have resources, we can chart out all the personal information. We have all the categories, and that's part of the data mapping, but also the third-party confidential information and what are the contractual obligations, because you may have very quick notification obligations, and if you fail to comply with that, you may be offside. So those are the two main categories, aside from your own proprietary valuable information.
And speaking of third parties, Bob, you highlighted in a prep call leading up to this event that even if you do have all the right, measures in place as a company, when a vendor gets attacked or, hacked, it can lead to vulnerabilities because of a third party hack, right? So how can boards assess where their vulnerabilities lie? Should they always be looking at these third parties? Like, how do we fit in with that?
Yeah, definitely. Boards have got to be thinking about third parties. I mean, Ruth was talking about some aspects to it, but the other part of it is what do you rely on these third parties to provide for you as part of your day-to-day operations? What are the goods and services they provide? It could be something, and I say as simple as, the trucking company that brings in the raw products in the morning and the finished goods out at the end of the day. If that trucking company gets hit by a cyber attack such that they're not in business, then you've got a perfectly operating business that can't get anything in any out of your business. So you're going to get hit by that. So the boards are going to want to be thinking about, does your IT department, for example, have any visibility into who your suppliers are? And are they engaging with those suppliers to determine, what's their level of cybersecurity? Are they resilient at all? And if they go down, and picking up on what Ruth was saying, if one of those suppliers goes down for a period of time, what's the impact on your business? And then the other part about that is a lot of third parties actually have access into your data. You set it up, or into your corporate data, you set it up because it really facilitates or enables the paying of bills. So they can send you a bill electronically and you can pay them electronically, but they're cooking right into your corporate system. And the risk in that is whatever cyber vulnerability they've got, you now have just inherited that vulnerability because they're getting access into your system. And it's a good opportunity for the IT department to start to engage with their business units to start to say, okay, who do we need to be thinking about and helping to protect outside our business that's critical for us keeping our businesses actually operating.
Sam, you'd mentioned something in advance of this event that I hear a lot, that data storage is your last line of defense and your first line of recovery. But what does that mean to you? Like, can you expand on us tell us a little bit about what that means and why that's something that is such a golden rule in cybersecurity?
Well, I think that most organizations that have implemented a cybersecurity strategy tend to focus on prevention. So there's a lot that goes into networks and firewalls and monitoring, logs within servers, et cetera. But storage tends to actually be an afterthought, which is where the data that they're trying to steal resides. Yes, there's also attacks on applications as well. But at the end of the day, all the data sits down in the storage. And when you ultimately recover from something like a ransomware attack, you have to recover your data back onto your storage because that's where the application runs. So if you're able to put or detect certain patterns within the data access itself on the storage, similar to the types of detection that happens in networks, you can actually be the last opportunity to detect strange access to data based on different types of applications or users and detect an attack there. And then number two, when it's time to recover, you've got to get that data back online and you have to have a strategy to bring it back. So in both cases, and trying to prevent the attack and recovering from the attack, you're going to end up at the storage layer. And it tends to be the afterthought. And in many organizations, the team that manage the storage are not involved in the planning or strategy around cyber resiliency or data resiliency. For example, I see in a lot of organizations, you may have a storage administrator responsible for making a replica of the storage in case something happens to it, they can recover it back. And you may have a backup team responsible for backing up applications. But neither of those people are responsible or own that cyber recovery when a cyber attack happens. They're not part of the strategy and planning for that recovery. So there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity to put detection closer to the storage itself, using things like entropy at the storage layer, looking at changes in data access patterns or data reduction patterns or other things in the storage. So implementing new technology and AI down at the storage layer to accelerate detection, and an opportunity to bring additional team in that have skills that are already managing storage to be part of that recovery process or planning or practice. Ruth talked about, kind of running through what would you do scenarios. Do you have the IT team that's managing the storage involved in that discussion and what their role is to play? They can also help with some of the forensic evidence after the fact. If you keep around immutable copies of data within your storage devices, then you can try to figure out part of how the incident happened, which is also very important for, number one, catching the criminal, but more importantly, preventing another attack. Because most people who get attacked again because they have a vulnerability that they have not yet fixed.
I want to switch it up a little bit because one of the things I think that people might not realize, and I think it's so much more important now to realize, is that a lot of this is still about people, right? And we're talking about different roles here that are played in order to prevent, but also even from the other side, which is, the people that we're talking about they're attacking you. Sometimes actually, in fact, they might not even need to be people, but they're just people that have put in those, different ways in which to attack companies. But I'm wondering from a leadership perspective, and I'm going to go around the room with this, and I'll start with you, Ruth, on this. But if you're in a non-technical leadership role, what are 2 or 3 questions you should be asking the teams handling cybersecurity?
Well, on the human error, that is a big one. And the question there is, what strategies are we using? Specific strategies are we using to effectively manage the risk of human error? Because that is the number one problem. And everyone says you're only as strong as your weakest link. It's very true. And the strategy has to be quite complex and layered. It's not just saying, oh, we have an education program, we send out a link, everyone has to watch a video once a year. That doesn't cut it. You have to understand how effective is that strategy. You have to run tests. You have to run fake phishing scams with your employees. You have to understand who is repeatedly failing. You have to have a strategy for how you deal with the employee who fails 3 times. What are you going to do? Some companies have policies, 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, you have to have some protocol around what you do with that information. And there's, and we have to pay even more attention to this with the sort of hybrid work scenario, which, we did see a spike when we all started working from home. It wasn't that surprising because we didn't have our colleague next door. We weren't chatting in the kitchen to say, oh, I got that email too. That is weird. Or what, that sort of natural exchange that leads you to be a bit more cautious. So that's, I think, the number one area and a question that should be asked within the organization. You don't need to be technically minded. And I'm glad you asked this question. I'll just throw this on because I feel like with cybersecurity, there's a misunderstanding that it's purely a technical issue. And so people who are not technically skilled feel like they have to step back and defer to those who are technically skilled. And it's a team sport. I mean, everyone has to be involved. And people who are in risk management have to learn how to just ask the questions that are similar to any other risk management issue. But the fact that they don't understand the technology behind cybersecurity shouldn't make them defer to those who are technical, because they're not always thinking about the same sort of overriding risk management issues that management is.
And on the flip side of that, Steve, what's your advice for people in technical roles trying to translate this world of cybersecurity to people in non-technical roles?
It's funny because I've had a lot of different jobs throughout the course of my career, and in a couple of those jobs I reported to the CFO. And when I first got that job, I thought I was being punished by God reporting to an accountant as a cybersecurity person. But it took me very little time to realize that it was one of the best training scenarios I'd ever had, because I was trying to speak German to a French person. You're trying to speak technical to an accountant, and accountant's thinking dollars and cents. And I've had a lot of education in my career, a lot of different university certificates in data science and whatnot. But the most important, I always tell people this, I get asked this a lot, but what's the most impactful, was risk management that I took at York University. It's about a 6-month course. And I highly, highly recommend this for anybody that's aspiring to move up the chain, because what it taught me to do was to think in terms of how risk translates to dollars and cents. And I always tell my leaders, my directors and whatnot, that this is the language by which cybersecurity people get money. If you want money for mitigation, you need to quantify that in a way that makes sense to the business audience, because it comes down to, if you have a risk that has a 20% chance of costing you $5 million over a 5-year period, that's your annual loss expectancy is $1 million a year. Okay, so you can expect a reasonable chance to lose $1 million a year. So if I'm going into my boss and I'm saying I want to spend $100,000 or $200,000 to mitigate this risk, that sounds like a deal. Now, if I have a risk that is going to cost $50,000 and I want to spend $100,000 to mitigate it, don't do that. It doesn't make sense. It's not a good business case. It's cheaper to accept the risk than it is to mitigate it. And this is the language you need to communicate. And that risk management course really taught me to do that better than anything else. And the experience of working with accountants and other business leaders, they think in terms of dollars and cents. And what I tell my more junior people is, they think that our job is to keep the bad guys out. And I tell them it's not. Our job is to protect revenue. And you have to understand that what I spend to protect that revenue has to be less than the revenue I'm protecting. And you need to understand how to communicate that. This is by far the most important language lesson I've learned in my career. And it's the ability to translate. If you're trying to go to business leaders and say, the bad guys are going to get us and it's terrible and we have to stop it now, and they're going to say, how much is it going to cost me? Why should I do this? If you can't quantify that, you're done. Simple as that. So that is the mechanism. The risk management training that I had is the mechanism by which technical people communicate with non-technical people, and then it works. It's a very plain language that gets the job done.
Sam, how do you translate that cost idea that Steve brought up? You know, this advice for getting people on board with the cost of cybersecurity and data resiliency, building it. How do you get people on board with that?
Well, I think that's the really key point, because we talk about implementing new technologies in order to defend an organization. And that requires in a lot of cases, new budget, or having skilled resources coming on board, or hiring a third party to implement some of those technologies. So I think what Steve said is absolutely right. We've got a lot of research that talks about the likelihood of an event happening, and we can help share that with our customers, and the cost of real events that have happened to our customers. We do quite a bit of research on this, and we will actually arm storage teams, backup teams, or CISOs with all the information they need to describe the risk and how much we can mitigate that risk, and put it purely into a business case, because this is a simple business decision. It really is. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So we make it very easy for them. It's just a matter of, you got to talk to somebody who can help you with this. If you don't have the skills to lay it out yourself, there's plenty of companies out there that can help you with it. IBM being one, but there are others that can help you with the real examples of how this has happened, and makes it really a simple decision at the end.
Bob, I have to ask you as well about, you know, because one of the things we're talking about here are having these voices at the table when assessing and building data resiliency strategies. And because, you know, people that are bringing up this cost, people that are reminding you of the things that you will lose if you don't have it, who needs to be at the table?
Yeah, I think when you start talking about cybersecurity, you've got to look at this as a whole of business undertaking. It isn't just the IT shop, but you've got to be thinking about this from the IT side, the policy side, the technology side. I mean, certainly that's got to be there. But the driver for all of this has got to be the leadership at the top of the organization. This is a CEO level initiative. You've got to involve all of the business units. So again, not just the IT shop, and Ruth was talking about that. But when you actually start to get into incidents, it becomes quite an audience that you're going to have around that table. You're going to have your legal team in there, your communications department, your human resources. Certainly the finance department's got to be there, and the IT. So this basically involves the whole business getting together to actually deal with this. And ideally what you'd want to be doing, and we've talked about this a little bit before, about the recovery from all of this starts before the incident happens. So don't wait till the incident happens to get those people together to start thinking about, do we have a plan? Have we exercised it? Do we know what our roles are? And walk through some of those things that are going to happen when the incident occurs. And everybody's going to have a role, and they're going to be surprised that they actually have a role in it. If you went to them right off the bat without talking to them ahead of time, they're going to be surprised that they do have something to do with that. So you're going to have to walk through some exercises with them so they start to understand what's their piece in actually dealing with this, because that's the only way the business is going to recover from it, is with everybody, all hands on deck.
And that top-down idea that you mentioned, Bob, Ruth, I want to ask you, why do we see this sort of reluctance from C-suite executives to proactively implement cybersecurity and policies that could allow for this type of resilient data?
I think historically it's been because of a misunderstanding that it was simply a risk, not a certainty of attack. There was also a lack of appreciation that this was a management issue, that there was deference. This is the issue that thought, well, IT deals with security. Why do I have to think about it? And IT doesn't think about security in the same way that the CEO is. The CEO is going to ask very different questions than the head of IT. And so now we are seeing, I think the tides are turning. We are seeing companies, you know, at the executive level and CEO level, starting to implement strategies, to assign committees, to start, you know, to design a protocol and policies. We are still seeing, frankly, though, the same mistakes being made. You know, we get calls all the time for various cyber attacks, and still we see repeated mistakes. So there's still the learning process doesn't end. Your strategy is not sort of put it on the shelf and that's it. You have to continue to revisit it. And I think for companies that are just getting going, the more they have tabletop scenarios and involve outside experts, because it's actually not at a very high cost to have a tabletop scenario and involve a couple outside experts. They have a very unique perspective because we see it all the time. We deal with this every day. And so you can get some very useful strategic advice that will save you a lot of money at a very low price.
We're just at the end of our time for this segment of the event. But I guess I want to sort of go around the room as last words almost from you guys as advice, because one of the things we do see is the same mistakes happening over and over again, right? So what are some of those things? Maybe perhaps I'll ask you to listen to one person before you, just so we don't repeat them, right? The same advice, but something new for people to hold on to at the end of this, that they can hold on to in ways in which they can allow for their companies to be preventing these attacks. So I'll start with you, Steve, and then we'll go around. One piece of advice that you'd really, really think people should be holding on to.
It goes back to the risk management. I can't stress that enough, how important, how critical that was. Quantifying things in terms of probability and impact on a heat map. It's a standard risk management tool. If something is a high probability to occur and a high impact, you're going to spend the most money on that. If it's low probability, low impact, you're going to accept that risk. Like putting in things into a heat map and then assigning dollars and cents to them, that's the best chance of getting through the senior management. When they realize that there's something that's a high probability of occurring and has a high probability of taking their whole business down, that's when you're going to get their attention, right? That's the most important thing I've ever learned in my whole career.
Bob, what about you? What's your one piece of advice that you really think people should be holding on to?
I think businesses have got to start operating from the premise that it's only a matter of when they're going to be attacked, not a matter of if. And so that means putting all this stuff off and dreaming and hoping and wishing that it's going to be somebody else down the street doesn't cut it. And that then leads right back into Steve's comments that once you've accepted that this is going to hit you, then start to talk and put into place the planning things that Steve was referring to.
And Sam, what about you?
It goes back to what Steve said about high probability and high impact. It is high probability and it is high impact. And I'm going to guess some of the people here have already been hit that are actually watching this this discussion. So we already know that. You need to put together a plan. You need to know who owns what, and you need to know how you're going to respond when an event happens. At a very minimum, you have to have some kind of strategy, and you need to start working on it. You're not going to fix it all overnight. You got to start putting a plan in place. That's the biggest thing I'll give you to take away with. Who in your organization is responsible and what is your plan? And if you're not there today, what is the plan to get there?
And Ruth, the last word on this, what's some advice that you really think people should have?
Don't hold on to information any longer than you need it, because I see that all the time. Ransomware attack. We look at what data was exfiltrated, and it's information that they didn't even know they didn't need, but now they have possible exposure associated with keeping that information. And it was costing them money to actually retain the information for storing it. So it's sort of like a double hit. So
as a storage person, as a storage person, I don't mind you holding on to the data, but Ruth's right.
Okay. Thank you all so much. I think we'll have to leave it there for now. Steve, Ruth, Sam, Bob, you will all be rejoining us in 10 minutes to take the questions that we have coming in. I have lots of really great ones already coming in, but if you have any questions for them, please submit them, and we'll be sure to ask them right after this next segment. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Ali Abbas Mehboob Hirji. Ali has been a catalyst for team development and leadership across various stages of IT development. He's right now an advisor at cyberattacks. His achievements include pioneering the expansion of Durham College's Cybersecurity Innovation Center and spearheading the establishment of AI and cybersecurity labs. Thank you for joining me, Ali.
You're always welcome. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Let's jump right into the questions that I have for you today. We have a shorter time, but I want to make sure it's effective for people to understand. And so I'll start with, what are some methods for protecting data that worked perhaps a year ago, but are maybe less effective today?
Great question. Well, Timur, here's what I'm going to say. One of the things that I always tell my board when I've served as a CISO is once upon a time when it came to protecting data, a lot of it was focused on there's technology and then there's the education of users. But I've always said this, that the goal of education is not knowledge, but action. So you need to have very, very strong awareness programs in place so folks understand the types of data that they have and what the liabilities are when you assume that data. If you don't need to hold on to something, don't keep it. But here's the challenge. A few years ago, signature-based detections would typically work for me. So if I quote a well-known CISO who's now the operating partner for Kraft Ventures, Bill Harmer, once upon a time it used to be, I connect, therefore I am. Somebody's connected, they've authenticated into a system, it is the right person who's supposed to be touching that data. We used to look at those signature things. You're in New York, you live in New York and suddenly your credit card is used in Toronto, signature, that shouldn't be happening, put an alert. Those used to work to a degree, used to have those perimeters. Now in comes in the pandemic, in 2 months, you see 2 years worth of innovation. And now from a data protection standpoint, those signature monitoring techniques no longer are effective. We always talk about the perimeter is dead, your traditional perimeter. You now have to have more behavioral analytics as a part of it. Yes, I'm going to use it in a very contextual way. You need to have some sort of baselining done, some sort of AI in there as well that can tell you what is potentially anomalous activity. It's no longer just protecting the data because you could sign in. It's about knowing what the user's behaviors are over a period of time and having the right baselines and detection against that. And the challenge with this is, Timur, it's technically quite challenging, requires a certain skill set, and unfortunately, it is quite expensive as well. So it is one of those challenges today that we're dealing with.
Ali, one of the things we've heard a lot today about is backups and immutable backups, right? And a lot of our panelists earlier just touched on this because it is such an important aspect of resiliency. Can you explain what they are, these immutable backups that we're talking about, and how do you actually test them?
Yeah, so these immutable backups are really backups that once, or the data sets that once you've created cannot be modified, deleted, edited, or anything of that nature. And when we talk about immutable backups, you're essentially talking about backups either at a certain point in time or in real time, that if the organization needed, they could access that data and potentially bring systems back up or at least get mission critical items. For me, there are two principles to the immutable backups. Number one is, who are the tech partners that you're working with that can ensure that these backups don't sit on your current production environment, don't sit in your current environment, because should you have experienced a breach and those backups are in your current environment, there's no way to tell whether those backups have not been impacted as well. So an immutable backup sits outside of that network environment. That's the first thing. And you have to work with a partner, with a vendor that can assist you with doing. There are a lot of solutions that come out of the box that you can use. And depending on the types of data that you have and the size, the costs exactly, they vary. The second thing about your immutable backups is testing them. No point telling us that, yeah, we have backups. Well, you have to have a process in place where, let's say today I want to now spin up the backup environment. How quickly can you bring that environment back up? Many of you might remember the Toronto Public Library situation, right? I was going to assume there may have been some backups, but how quickly can you bring those back up and bring operations back to a semi-status quo is very critical. So you have to have procedures in place to test that backup. And some of the CISOs in the room and the practitioners in the room will have certain criteria that you have to meet to ensure that your backup process is not just a product in place, but it has a people, process, and technology component in it, so that tomorrow the board knows if our core system goes down, within 30 minutes, we can have all of the, for example, patient data back up in a separate environment, and mission critical surgeries will not get delayed or postponed. That's the key behind immutable backups.
Yeah, even with the weather network attack that I covered quite a bit, backups was key for them to come back to it. One of the things I also want to talk with you about is, because of your experience with AI and cybersecurity, I want to ask you, how has that impacted the threat landscape that we're talking about right now?
When it comes to the threat landscape, one of the things that I like to say is that, look, and especially AI, Not everybody's going to agree with my postulation about what AI does, so on and so forth. And I never learn from people that always agree with me. It's better when people disagree, so you see different perspectives. AI is a little bit of a buzzword in some cases, and I'll be very brutally honest when I say this. You'll find situations where folks, especially in the venture capital scene, are claiming products are using AI, but really it's nothing but bottom-up programming. There's not, or top-down programming, right? It's all scripts at the end of the day. So I want to preface this by saying that. Now, the threat landscape, I'll tackle this question in two ways. Number one is everything at the end of the day is around one simple premise: in data we trust. The more you put out there, the more this data is going to be studied. I just finished a session with one of my team members where I was talking about how a threat actor did reconnaissance to find out which systems they were using in their operations. They didn't send somebody on the inside. They didn't try and do something extremely technical. They read our job descriptions and our job postings. And in that we said, we're using Siemens this, or we're using HP this, and not to sort of point out those vendors specifically, but you mentioned what tech you're using. And now imagine if you have one or two job descriptions, sure, the naked eye will be able to glare information from that. But you've got a million job descriptions. In my lifetime, I can't browse a million job descriptions in a minute, but AI can. So when you have AI being able to do that kind of parsing for you and gathering intelligence and insights from the data that we're putting out, thinking it's harmless, that's one way in which actors are using this AI. The second thing is you have to recognize something. There's one thing about using AI to defend your environments, and there's another conversation around defending AI itself. And I really, really, without going into the depths of it, but you look at threat actors, I really recommend people realize, and we have folks from CCTX here, for example, folks have to realize that a lot of these threat actors, they're not just acting on the motivation of money alone. There are geopolitical tensions that tie into it. There are other points that they're trying to make. We really need to, the audience needs to get into a better practice of reading some of these reports and these motivations, these APTs, these TTPs that they're using, because that gives you a better sense of how these actors are going to use AI, what kind of algorithm intelligence do they have, what kind of AI skills do they have in their homegrown, what may they purchase, so on and so forth. So that's my very short 2 rupees of thought on this. But for future, if we ever talk about geopolitical motivations and AI, there's a lot that we can dive into.
Yeah, it's really important to stay informed about the threat landscape. We're just almost at the end of the time for this interview, but I'll ask you one more question before we go back to our overall speakers and talk to everybody about the questions that we have coming in. I guess the last question I'll ask you is one that I've sort of asked the other panelists too, but it's important to ask you and get as many perspectives on this. What is something you wish C-suite leadership would ask their cybersecurity teams on the other side? What do you think they should be asking?
Yeah, so one of the things, and I'm going to go back to something that was said earlier on, is tabletop exercises. Yeah. And I am not talking about tabletop exercises for the technical team alone. I'm talking about drills for the board members. I'm talking about drills for every level in the organization, because everyone during an attack or a suspected attack, everyone can be customer facing in their own unique way, and someone can say something. So for me, it's those tabletop exercises that are critical and that need to get, and you can gamify them, you can do whatever you need to do, but those need to be top of mind, because you have to consistently practice this. You have to consistently put yourself through drills, just like fire drills and emergency drills that we need to go through. The other thing that I'll say is I really, really, really hope that going into the future, as it relates to data as well, is that we're having this conversation around, I do believe that a chief data officer now, especially in large enterprise, is critical. Because understanding the types of data, why are we asking for address when somebody's registering for a ticket to come to an online event or something to that nature? Someone who can do those audits for you, those privacy impact assessments for you. It's no longer that everything sits under security, and if something happens from a privacy standpoint, Steve, come and solve it. Well, security and privacy have slightly different praxis, and we need to now identify that. We've moved away from the days that security sits under IT. Let's also now move away from just thinking security knows everything about the data that we have. There has to be a little more. We have to recognize the complexities that come with it. So those tabletops are critical for me.
And that's something Ruth had mentioned quite a bit earlier as well. Okay. So let's now welcome back all of our speakers and begin taking audience questions. This one's a bit more informal. I have a phone here where I've been buzzing with lots of questions for all of you. Lots of really great ones coming in. So I'll start by sort of having, and I'll go around the room because some of them are directed and more specific to some of the things you guys have talked about. I think I'll start with this one, which is a really good one to sort of think about it from a talent pool perspective, because I think people are thinking about this. What does the talent pool look like for the cybersecurity industry? Do we have enough people at the moment? Any of you maybe volunteer to answer that question? Do you have any thoughts?
Go ahead,
maybe
Bob.
I'll go to Bob first, and then I'll go to Steve.
Sorry, Steve. Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a shortage of skills, people out there to do all the jobs that are coming through, and we need the skills at a variety of levels. So you need it coming out of the university level, and you also need it at the entry level, the first line cyber operators going through lots of programs that are coming through. But it's also an opportunity. I mean, don't want to pump my organization, but it's one of the things we do where companies can get together and share ideas and best practices. Yeah. So smaller companies that haven't got that technical depth can benefit from what other companies do. Some of the banks, for example, are very good at trying to reach out to their supply chain companies to help them along. So there are ways that you can try to get around that skills gap that we've got for the next while.
Steve, do you have anything to add on this? I have a specific question for you too, but yeah.
Okay, well, I'll be very brief. My tactic, you go to a cybersecurity conference and it's pretty difficult not to notice that it's very male heavy. 70, 80%. And a lot of them are, people have gotten into the cybersecurity career, later in life, different skills and so on and so forth. So I tend to I go after high schools. I speak to high school audiences before they've chosen a degree in an overserviced area, and I talk to them and I say, look, there's this huge sucking demand that is unfulfilled because nobody at your level is thinking about it. So you get the high school students before they've chosen their career, get them to realize that this is a great career. And I specifically talk to young girls, like high school, teenage age girls. I say, there's a massive audience that wants to hire you, but you're not there. And to me, what I'm doing is I'm effectively doubling my talent pool. And if you can reach that audience at that time and get them to make a choice and point out, especially to young women, that if you choose this career, you just have a massive advantage. They want to hire you. There aren't enough of you. If you're good at this, you can excel very well in this career. And that's my strategy to really bring new people, young people into the field and fill the gap that we all suffer from.
Ollie, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, just 30 seconds. Two very quick things. One of the things that I like to tell, especially when I teach, is that I don't think there's a cyber security technical shortage. I believe there's a shortage of cybersecurity professionals who can communicate well, who can collaborate well. It makes a very big difference. And one of the things that I enjoy in some of my advisory roles, like the one at cyberattacks, is these CTFs, these capture the flags, these hackathons, also allow us to look at the special skills and the insights that some of these learners have. Then you can build it. I always say this at hackathons and CTFs. What you're learning is not to, as a student, you're being educated not to just look at mirrors, convert those mirrors into windows, into opportunities. A lot of these young students, like Steve just mentioned, have different insights and different perspectives. And when you look at the immigrant community as well, different language skills, etc., all matter a great deal. That diversity is so important to enhance not just the technical skills, but the people and process skills that we need.
Ruth, I have a question specifically for you that came in. So is there any real protection or benefit of having company-wide insurance for cyber attacks, given that there are always fine prints?
So cyber insurance has been a bit of a moving target over the last several years. It's sort of contracted. Now it's expanded a bit. There is no off-the-shelf cyber insurance. You need to know precisely what you're getting. But before you even decide what cyber insurance to get, you need to understand what your risks are. What are your most realistic risks? What are the costs of those risks? And how could you maybe offset some of those costs through insurance? But you can't just sort of go acquire or procure cyber insurance and think you're covered. And then really important is some risks are just simply not covered by cyber insurance. There could be regulatory penalties. that are not covered, or various other exposure. Ransomware payments are rarely covered these days. So you need to understand your sort of total risk strategy and how insurance plays a part into that.
Yeah. Do you think there's still a benefit to having those though, Ruth?
So insurance?
Yeah.
Well, I think it certainly can be, although we are seeing a lot of companies self-insure. It just depends what their risk profile is and whether it makes sense. But again, we come back to quantifying what your risk is. You have to have a dollar value assigned to it. Otherwise, it's sort of it's just in a vacuum. You're making these decisions about procuring insurance. I mean, how do you understand the value without understanding how it fits into your overall dollar value risk?
Yeah, because it's not a blanket, right? Sam, there's a question I have for you. How safe do you consider cloud storage to be? As a small business, my company relies heavily on Google Drive.
Yeah, well, so cloud storage is safe in general. I mean, it depends on what you mean by safe. Somebody could still hack into that account, a Google Drive account, exfiltrate your data, and they could encrypt the data on there or delete the data. So the question then is, do you have a backup of that data? A lot of people don't realize when they put data in the cloud that you still need to back it up. They may use a SaaS application. Most SaaS applications don't have any level of backup supported with them. I mean, years and years, people have used Microsoft 365 and they've thought they're covered, but they're not. If anything happens, you need your own strategy for backing up and recovering it. A lot of companies use cloud as a repository for their backups, which can be a good strategy as well. And most cloud object storage type solutions provide an immutable option, which allows you to lock that data so it can't be changed. So you have a copy you know will be the same as when you put it in there. But the thing you need to consider is when it comes time to recover that data, how long will it take to copy it back? So in the case of certain data, it doesn't matter if it takes a while to bring it back. You could wait a week while it copies down. But in other applications, you need to get back up and running right away. You might need to be able to bring that data quickly. And like we're all, locked in the laws of physics of how quickly you can move data over a network. So you really need to think through the entire strategy of it. But there's nothing not secure about cloud storage, though cloud storage doesn't solve the problems on its own. You still run the same risk as you do with your on-prem storage. So you need to think through that.
Yeah, Steve, I have a specific question for you too. We're almost at the end of our time. We really have just about a couple minutes left. So I'll do this question, then maybe one more if we have a little time. Which sort of what do you do scenarios should companies be testing out, Steve?
Which sort of what do you do scenarios? Wow. It's kind of, I mean, I could answer that in any number of different ways. I'm going to go back to the data. I mean, what do you do? How do you generate your revenue? It goes back to that. I mean, how do you generate your revenue? Practice that. There are a lot of things that companies do. Out of 100 things you could pick off the list, I guarantee you 10 of them are the ones that really matter to the revenue stream that your company counts on. And without the revenue stream, there is no risk greater than no money in the bank. I would say that. So I would figure out what puts the money in the bank and test that. That's as simple as that.
Yeah. Okay, one last question. Bob, I'll let you answer this one. And this is a very simple question that we started off with, but I think it's a good one to end with in some ways. How do most hackers gain access to corporate data?
Phishing attacks coming through is still the number one attack coming through. And unfortunately, they're getting really sophisticated at doing it. So you used to be able to pick those off fairly easy by all the typing mistakes, spelling mistakes in it, but it's getting harder to do that. So it gets back to, and all of us have talked about it, gets back to the training, the awareness programs, and informing your employees of what to look for and how to react, and think about it before you click on it. That's the main message. If it looks too good to be true, I guarantee you it's bad news. Don't click.
Okay, Ali, I'll let you have one last quick word on that. I know you wanted to say something on it, and then I'll just wrap it up.
An interesting way in which bad actors have got in, 2020, early days of COVID, cleaning companies overnight coming into your offices to clean. people leaving little data points around, and cleaning companies getting paid to take pictures and move that over. So keep that in mind.
Okay, lots of great points and so much to think about. It does look like we'll have to leave it there, though. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I would really like to thank you all, Ali, Ruth, Bob, Steve, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would also like to thank everyone in the audience for attending and all the great questions. They were fantastic. And of course, IBM for supporting today's webcast. We will be sharing a link to the recorded webcast in about 1 week. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Enjoy it.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.